My name is Carl Quill, and this is Founder Quest, a podcast about the journeys of starting a game studio. Today, we're talking with Eli Allen of Wild Blue Studios. Eli is a unique guest for our show in a few ways. Wild Blue Studios has been operating for 7 years, where many of the guests I've had on so far are still in their first few years as a company. Wild Blue is also an art service provider rather than a dev studio. As well, they are also a worker cooperative. We talk a lot about what each of these differences mean for Eli's founding journey and what he's had to learn and been challenged by along the way. What I was struck by, though, is how many similarities and lessons there are here for founders of any stripe. I'm hoping you feel the same way. Let's jump in. The place I always tend to start is there's a moment, right? Like there's sometime you're like, I want to start a thing, and you're thinking about it, but then there's some moment that you cross that threshold of, I'm thinking about doing it, to no, I'm doing this. Like we're going down the path, we're incorporating, we're doing all the like setting up QuickBooks, all that kind of stuff. I'm always curious what led up to that moment and sort of pushed you over.
Yeah. So for context, the inciting incident was my departure from Riot. I was extremely fortunate to start my career at Riot. I hadn't worked in games prior to that. I was in sporting goods before that, and I made the leap into games at Riot during a major expansion. This is the week of my 10-year anniversary in games. So in 2 days from recording, this will be my decade. And so at that time, they were radically scaling up their art department to meet the new size of the company and the new development demands and things like that. And I got a really good firsthand look at how to do that very early in my career and very early in my life, 22, 23. It was crazy. Mm-hmm. And so when I left, I was of two minds, where I was doing the job application thing, looking at some other positions, but at the same time, I had all this experience I hadn't expected to have in the early part of my career, and I thought, what made me want to get into all of this in the first place were the sort of rock star art houses of the early games industry, Massive Black, Six More Vodka, etc. These sort of household names that were like, hey, we're the, you come to us for our work, we make your game look incredible, and we're indispensable and one of a kind. And so I started talking to Mitch Malloy, who would go on to be my co-founder, and we were like, hey, do we think we could do this? Do we think we could do this, and could we put our own spin on it? And it was kind of daydreams at first because we were both freelancing and applying other places. But then we just kind of kept talking about it. And then eventually I attached a name to it in my head, and I instantly felt invested. I was like, okay, the more I talked about it, it just became like an entity. It became like almost a physical thing to me. And I slowly devoted more and more thought to it until it was all I was really thinking about. And there came a tipping point where I was like, well, actually the opportunity cost of this is way lower than I thought it was going to be. It turns out it's actually very easy to incorporate and do that stuff out of the box. If you mean to keep it going, it becomes significantly more complex quickly, but the actual getting started was well within budget. You could walk it back anytime with minimal spend. And so we thought, all right, let's just go over this edge. Let's make the thing, let's make the box, and then reach out to some people and see what happens. And yeah, it was just that moment where I was having a conversation with somebody, one of my mom's friends, because I was visiting home, and tried to explain the concept of what we were starting, and she was like, "Oh, like, what are you going to call it?" And I was like, "I was thinking of blah blah," and then I said it out loud, and it just kind of clicked, and I was like, "All right, it's this thing now." So
Yep. Names are powerful.
yeah,
It's always the challenge on the development side of if you name something too early, people get attached and it becomes that thing, right?
I I can think of a million examples. I mean, of products that keep their development names when they never intended to. Yeah, I can think of some very prominent ones that I guess I won't spill here, but yeah, it's pretty fun.
Yeah. So you had this build up, this momentum of thinking about it. The name came together. You understood how sort of like, oh, setting up an LLC or incorporating so easy, like all this kind of stuff. Once you actually like were fully committed, you had the conversation with your mom's friend, and you're like, okay, no, this is happening. What was the biggest like learning journey from there?
Oh, everything, right? So I this is like a classical. I wouldn't say like impulsive founder, but founding wasn't necessarily um, my goal or something I had developed, assigned a lot of forethought to, right? It happened very organically and alongside this expectation that I would just continue as an employee somewhere. Um, so I started the company thinking in my mind, like, oh, I'm going to be like the creative director here, right? I'm going to use this place as a means to get my creative direction chops up. And like, even if it fails, because in the early days, I didn't have any expectation that it would last longer than a year or be this sort of bridge piece um, between jobs. And I was like, I'm gonna be the creative director and do this stuff. And then very quickly, the reality set upon me that my co-founder Mitch is an incredible craftsman and artist, and fantastic leader and manager of teams as a bonus, which is like a very unicorn combination, which means that all that was really left to do was the sales and business and billing and compliance and all this stuff that was way outside my existing skill set or frankly realm of interest, but became immediately necessary. And so I always call it my word or my phrase for it is learning by braille, right? Just learning it as I go. I'll give a shout out to Seth Godin, business author. He has a Udemy course called the Value Creation Masterclass that was like super important in his freelancing masterclass. Like, once the work was upon us, I had to find resources that would help me contextualize and nail these things down and start me trapezing into the other skill sets that would, are my job today. And all of that happened on the fly. Yeah, I learned everything from the ground up and not necessarily by choice.
For sure, you sort of always have to take on whatever needs to get done.
Yeah.
What was the stuff in that was the hardest for you to learn versus the stuff that you found perhaps surprisingly came a little bit more naturally?
Yeah. I think the stuff I was surprised came naturally was the like sales and client services stuff. I am allergic to self promotion and, lo, these many years later, all the sales approaches I get are the huge majority of them. And this is something that comes with being a founder is your inbox is um, a graveyard of cold reach outs. And I'm not compelled by a lot of the sales stuff that I see, but the sort of like naturalistic sales approach and then taking care of clients and translating client needs, which turned out to be super, super critical in the service org, came to me a lot faster than I thought it was going to. And then the hard stuff was all of the um, building process documentation, future proofing the organization that especially once we started to pick up speed faster than we thought we were going to, we knew right away coming out of the backgrounds that we had, Mitch had worked at some studios that were sort of notoriously terrible to work at in the early days. And I had been so close to the process and documentation and tools stuff at Riot that I knew that everything that you do today will buy you a lot of security in the future. And even though especially when you're working with creative people and when you yourself, I myself, like to still think of myself as a creative, even though I'm the sales monkey, um, is uh, there's a tendency to say, we'll figure that out later, or yeah, we both understand, or all of us understand this. And the developing the discipline to the moment that you feel um, that tendency, or the moment that you start to hand wave, that you have to associate that feeling with, actually, this is where we need to stop and document. Um, and made a lot of false starts on that in the early days. And like I said, just developing that flinch to do it, and then the discipline to actually sit down and do it, even when it costs you time and brain space that you feel like you can't spare. It will save you in the long run.
Yeah, for sure. I think building those sorts of habits, especially when they are like against your natural grain of behavior, is so hard.
Yes.
But often very necessary. Um, so one of the main audiences that I think listen to this podcast are folks who are sort of at that tipping point that we talked about earlier, where they're thinking about starting a thing. They're like, maybe I'll start a thing, but they're on that edge of like, am I doing this or not? What, from your experience and going through this journey and your right of this, what's sort of the biggest learning that you would pass along to someone at that precipice?
Definitely. So I am fortunate enough to have this niche in the cooperative space, which we'll talk about later, that puts me in a position to do a lot of mentorship and counseling, and just one-on-one chats with people who breeze in and are like, I'm thinking about doing this. So I've had the opportunity to practice this quite a bit, and I like to say I'm equally proud of the companies that I've helped people. I've talked people out of founding as the ones that I've talked them into. So the number one learning I would say is, even when you have this bug, even when you have this momentum welling up inside you, it is okay to not follow through on it, because you want to make sure that you are fully committed and you fully understand as best you can, because nobody, you can tell people that the stove is hot and they won't truly believe you until they touch it. But you want you want to at least understand how hot the stove is, or have somebody explain it to you, and spend some time thinking about it. In most cases, if you're in a position to found, you can delay that starting gun as long as you like, because once the starting gun goes off, you have to be all in. You have to be ready to run flat out until either you finish the race, or you fall flat on your face, or collapse from exhaustion, or whatever, right? That's a lot of metaphor to say your company doesn't succeed, but it's okay to wait. It's okay to spend more time gathering opinions, getting your resources in a row, fully apprehending the space you're about to walk into, because once it starts, it does not stop. And then the other thing, and this is a constant refrain, like I said, I listened to a lot of episodes of your podcast before coming on here, which were all fantastic. And one of the things that a lot of people point to is, and one of the things that I tell people about, is make sure that you are not all one skill set in your founder makeup, especially in creative endeavors and creative businesses, and especially in the wake of things like large scale layoffs. So, everything that's been happening in the last 18 months, I get constant interest from teams and groups of people who have been laid off together, who we're the concept art team, or we're the sound team, or whatever. And they just want to keep going with what they were doing, rightfully so. And they want to capture that momentum and band together and say, why can't we do this ourselves? That's great. But if you don't already have somebody attached who is going to do all those things that, like I said, I had to learn the hard way, you have to plan from day one about who you're going to reach out to outsource it to, or you should be looking for an additional co-founder for whom that is their core competency. And the rest from there is more minor. So, make sure you know what you're getting into, and make sure you have a plan for the person who is going to shoulder the organizational load, because otherwise that's going to be foisted upon someone by necessity. And usually in a group, when you're talking to people, you can kind of tell who's going to end up being the beast of burden. And that can make or break your organization very early. And yeah, so those are my two biggest pieces of advice.
As the one who is organized enough and okay enough with playing the role of organization and producer. I have lived that life a lot.
Yeah.
But so let's talk a little bit about co-founders. You mentioned that your primary co-founder at the beginning was Mitch, and you guys worked together at Riot. Hilariously, I actually sat, I think, one like row of desks away from Mitch for a good chunk of my league career.
Yeah.
So as you guys were talking about this and thinking about this, how did you guys sort of talk about what that co-founder makeup was and how that would work out for the journey, right? Like, and I don't know if you had the full lessons and language that you do now, obviously at the time, but like, what were those conversations walking into it?
Yeah, we definitely did not have the sophistication at that point. You know, it was still a fairly vibes based endeavor. Um, and, but like I said, you know, Mitch was my Sherpa into this idea of the cooperative and things like that, and as well as, you know, he has a tremendous amount of community organizing experience. So like obviously we're a cooperative, and like I said, Mitch was a driving force behind that. That's a very labor oriented way to be, and Mitch participates in a lot of labor organizations which are self organized and things like that. So he really, I was drafting in his wake for a lot of it, and I'm so grateful for that. Because, you know, the company wouldn't exist without him, and so basically what it became was, you know, Mitch was already freelancing and he had more clientele than he really knew what to do with, and that's such a great place to be. But he also was like, I hate doing, you know, all these other things about it, and he knew a lot of other people who were in similar positions. And so that was what, realizing that there was more than one person like him out there, who was in this position, was the kind of spark that was like, okay, like we don't have startup capital. We're not going to seek funding. It's not the type of business you seek funding for in that way. Really, it's about how do you pull talent together. Mitch was like, okay, we do that by demonstrating that we're legitimate and that the work is out there. And he was like, here is my personal portfolio. We are now Wild Blue Studios. Go forth and acquire clients, and then we'll start recruiting people into it. And so the division of labor really broke down very quickly along those lines because of what we were, you know, the jobs that we both just started with, right? There's no question that Mitch was going to be the lead artist, and there was no question that I was going to be, at least for some time, this person who was kind of proving out the formula. And we had a bunch of other people waiting in the wings who were expressing mild interest or who were experiencing the same problems that we're ready to go into. So not a, I don't know, it was Mitch was like, you know, we have to prove that this exists for me as much as anybody else, and so here's the resources to go start doing that. And the more that you bring in, the more that I and everybody else will commit to it.
Got it. When you go back and think about that journey, right? Like we've talked about, you know, there was this building well of you thinking about it and you talking to Mitch about it, and maybe that this could be a thing. And really, you know, these conversations about how that would, you sort of how that labor would end up being divided, and how Mitch was bringing this artistic force and sort of portfolio to it, and then you ended up being like, okay, I'm going to draft into this, and you know, I can go out and build the business and get clients. What were the most important conversations along that journey that made you really feel like this is the right thing to do and Mitch is the right person to do it with, even though what that means is now I am doing not necessarily just artwork, right? Like now I am going to take on all these things because this is absolutely the right person to go along that. What were the conversations that drove that?
Ooh, interesting. Less so conversations, more so the experience of shipping work. I would say, you know, the conversations that underpinned it were the agreement on the cooperative as this concept that we thought was equitable and clear and almost obvious in the space, despite the fact that almost nobody is doing it. So I would say like that conversation is the conversation that served as the springboard, where it was like, okay, like this is how we're going to organize it, and we both care about that concept from the beginning. But after that, everything that clicked it into place for me and for us was actually going and getting the early clients. Shout out Dauntless, and shout out Icon's Combat Arena, neither of which still exists by the time of this recording, but were our first two clients in the door. And especially because, like I said, I was fresher to the games industry, and I had my first 3 years in games were in this incredible ivory tower where learning was very, very risk free, but also I was more separated from the end product than I hopefully ever will be again by being on this sort of infrastructural and scaling team. The first time we did something under our studio name that was, again, there's that emotional attachment component where it's like, this is us, we are Wild Blue Studios. The first time we did work that shipped to a client and then went public, I mean, it was like narcotic, right? Like when you see your stuff go out in like a patch video or something and people are like, whoa, this armor set is so sick. I was like, that's it. Like, that's what I was after this whole time. And that was, I would say that's the moment where I clicked into, I will do anything, fill any role, whatever, to make this my job. I don't really care where I come into the process anymore. And eventually, as we started to scale, the additional narcotic hit is bringing in really cool people and seeing them grow and like fighting viciously to make the space where they can comfortably and safely and happily grow. We're 7 years in at this point, and like even if it all blew up tomorrow, I would still have these incredible memories of or these experiences of watching people I really like go from fresh out of college to senior or things like that. And like that, I don't know, that's the other motivating factor. So I think that's the same for both Mitch and I, is like putting the work out there and then building the space where people we care about get to be safe and happy and productive. So
let's actually dive in a little bit to sort of that cooperative piece that is really unique about Wild Blue Studios, and I think is really, really cool. Tell us a little bit about that initial journey from it's you and Mitch into sort of the original co-founders into getting off the ground and starting to grow and building it out as a cooperative. What did that, there's sort of like a million questions there, but like, just a little bit about what was that journey like and what was it to get it off the ground? And then we'll dive into, I'm sure, lots of follow-up questions.
Yeah, so I think for the benefit of listeners, I should very briefly summarize what a cooperative in this context is. A cooperative is any business where the workers own the company equally. So it's one worker, one ownership share, one vote in corporate governance, right? In simplest terms. And that's a worker cooperative. There are other types of cooperatives like service cooperatives and these other things that are more esoteric or actually make a lot more sense in other industries. But for us, it's just the worker cooperative model, which means that every single member of Wild Blue Studios has the same level of ownership in a very functional, literal sense as myself and Mitch, right? I don't have any special privileges. I don't retain additional ownership share, etc. It is 100% equal ownership. So why do that? Couple reasons. One, super simple, and I'm very against self mythologizing, so I want to be as candid about it as possible. Is like I said, didn't have any money. So how do I essentially deferred my salary for the first 2 years of the company so that we could build bank and hire talent and pay talent first, right? So I'm serious, like no money, right? There's like $10,000 or something of startup capital, and so and that all went to paying Mitch's Mitch's salary to start with. So the one of the really good reasons to do that is it's an extremely motivating and enticing model to attract talent way above your normal ability to afford them, right? Think about how equity is distributed amongst funders and founders, right? But now spread that out to the entire company and basically saying to people, hey, like if you join, you are equally invested and equally rewarded forever, and you have an unrevocable voice in how this company is run forever. And we took it a step farther as well, where I have been since its inception and to this day the president of the company. However, myself and the rest of the board at the company can be recalled by simple majority vote at any time, right? Maybe the only time I would endorse the thought that an armed society is a polite society is what if you just gave every worker a gun? And so I think that for this, especially for the band of people that we were looking to recruit in the early days, a lot of them were people who were dissatisfied from experiences that they had at other studios because they felt so alienated from leadership decisions or the ability to hold people accountable. It was a very strong advertising tool to pick up our original core group. And from there, it just kind of kept making sense that you would run this type of group, this type of company this way. We realized very quickly that it's challenging to scale past a certain size, but none of us really had aspirations to super scale anyway. The goal was always boutique. The plan was always boutique. And so that wasn't much of an impediment. But once you hit around that cap, it does start to feel like, okay, maybe now this is slowing down our ability to do things like bring in. I'm sorry, I feel like I got off track from the question.
No,
So,
you're good. You're
okay.
good. You're good. I mean, I think it does, like where you were sort of headed was sort of like my next question, which is like, I think especially early on, it makes a ton of sense where it allows you to get talent, likely much more senior talent who is looking for something where they can have much more of that sense of ownership. And oftentimes, that's sort of senior talent, I think, at larger corporations has that frustration of I have high impact, but I don't necessarily feel like I have high ownership or high drive to move the organization, right? And so, I think that sort of benefit early on makes a ton of sense. But to your point, like what are the highs and the lows here at year 7 of like working in this model, having now functionally your entire crew is co-founders, your entire crew is participating in these decisions. Where does that really strengthen the organization, and where does that introduce a bunch of friction that you're willing to take on? But if anyone's like, oh, I'll start a co-op, they should understand like
Yes.
this is the friction you get, right?
Yeah, 100%. So, I think you're bang on, like you said, the initial proposition to seniors. That's a totally correct way to frame it. Is it's making people's relative impact, commensurate with their ownership, commensurate with their control in the organization, their influence in the organization. So 7 years on, how has it strengthened us? Well, for starters, we have ultra low turnover, right? We've had, I think, 3 people have left the studio in 7 years under their own power. One because he got his dream job elsewhere. One because we brought somebody on for a year in a super senior capacity to try to grow out another unit of the business that just we all ended up thinking like, hey, this isn't the right way to go. So it was a planned kind of like review in a year, and then he struck out on his own despite having like a great time being there. And then somebody else who was like, I think I'm just done with this industry, right? So it's those kinds of things are the only things that, aside from economic force majeure, that move people away from the company. Because really, truly, when you are co-owners and you actually see the benefit of that, and you are given that level of trust, and the organization actually follows through on that promise, people work exactly as hard as you want founders to work, because they know it's theirs. It's not just a paycheck after a certain point, although that's obviously critical to deliver to people. But you get that extra above and beyond because and the retention, which I think especially in our service organization is a huge plus. It's one of the biggest things that clients talk about frustrations with when they go outside the house to get work done, is the sort of bait and switch phenomenon, or the same team isn't there month to month on the other side. But for the health of the organization, keeping people there, keeping people invested, keeping people strong and interested is built into the model. Where it creates friction, like I said, scale. Each new person that you bring on as a full member gets a key to the castle, and that becomes an increasingly complex proposition, and makes hiring decisions very, very high pressure, because one wrong hire can have really large outsized effect on the organization, much more so than other places. And so almost all cooperatives have this feature of you have a probationary period of some number of months or up to a year or so where you are not invested as a full member, and then the membership votes to bring you on and things like that as a sort of safeguard against that. But the other part of it is all of that stability that I'm talking about as a positive becomes a little bit of an albatross, because the promise you're making to people when they join a cooperative is that you'll be able to deliver that stability to them. And so, especially in a service organization, you can really only confidently grow on service lines or on relationships that you think will actually continue into the future at scale, will continue to provide the revenue streams, et cetera, that allow you to pay for people. Because if XYZ client disappears overnight and you hired people in to on a permanent basis to work on that product, suddenly you are right up against it, right? Because you have to immediately find new work streams or trapeze into something else in order to keep those people. And we're just not comfortable undermining what should be the core promise of the company with the potential for a layoff or something that is almost entirely out of our hands. We can influence our relationships and we can maintain them and we can do sales processes, but at the end of the day, developers, experience all kinds of external pressures, and service providers are the first on the chopping block. So
when you think about bringing folks on or like growing the team, to your point, this is almost like a co-founder dating conversation more than a job interview set of questions. And so what do you find, right? I'm sure every member of the cooperative has their own sort of sets of questions or pieces that they think are the most important when they talk to someone. But for you, like as you're feeling out these additional co-founders functionally, what are the most important conversations to have with them as you're making that determination of should we bring this person on to that level?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny you mentioned that, because we're reasonably lucky that as an art services company, we can very very quickly answer the question of whether people's ability to deliver craft is up to par or whatever, right? Like when we open positions, we get hundreds and hundreds of applicants, like way outsized versus our company size, and it's grueling but simple to sort through them, because a 15-second glance at the portfolio is the very first filtering mechanism. And by the time we're actually interviewing somebody, all our questions about their ability to do the work are long since answered. And it is just about, who are you? How do you think about work? How do you think about art? How do you think about the industry? How do you think about life? And will you fit in here? The one of the main things that we champion actually is art needs to occupy like a very central professional place for people, but we really want applicants to have very, very strong interests outside of their craft. So one of the key filtering questions is, all right, like what are you passionate about, and you can't say art, right? So like for instance, one of our senior concept artist lives and works on and runs a fully functioning farm. Another one is like an award-winning bird photographer and creates wildlife education pamphlets and all these other things that are like related but feed into their craft. And we don't want, like I said, that question has so long since been answered by the time we're interviewing people that it's really just about like, how do you think about your responsibility to others? How do you navigate conflict? Do you have like emotional resilience, and do you understand that even the most creative, even the most pen to tablet job here is not this mystical act of creation, it's labor. And how do you approach your conception and discussion of that, because at the end of the day, like this organization is about we're labor first, and that means that we have to have a very strong conception of what labor is, and that's underpins how we talk about everything in the studio.
When you think about sort of the group of everyone at the studio, really, can you talk a little bit about how you end up making decisions, dealing with disagreements, sort of like what like I think so many listeners who sort of have this classic startup visage, when we talk about this kind of thing, it's like, oh, me and my other co-founder, my my two other co-founders, we have a disagreement about a decision on the product, and like we have to hash it out or whatever. A decision with should we take this investment or that investment or whatever, we have to hash it out. But obviously, for you guys, both because you're more of a service-based company and a cooperative, those things look very different. And so, just having a little bit of context of like, what does that look like? How do you guys find that you best make decisions, deal with disagreements, go through that?
Yeah. So one thing, like I said, that whole labor mindset underpins a lot of this and helps it move away from big personalities clashing about their feelings and more into, because everybody is a co-owner, we really culturally enforce the terms of the conversation revolving around health of the company, the actual material underpinnings of a decision in dollars and cents, and how that relates to how we keep everybody fed for the greatest amount of time. So that's a huge boon. And one of the other things, a very common misconception about cooperatives is that everybody is in every room participating in every decision. We have a board of directors. It is directly elected on a cycle, and like I said, subject to recall. That's a super huge point for us, is direct accountability of leadership. And so leadership always has to take the advisory of membership very, very closely, because if the membership doesn't believe that you're serving their interests or you're making decisions that are out of their interest, they have direct recourse to remove you from the ability to do that. However, there is a separate and distinct decision-making body that is much more compact, much more streamlined, and much more able to captain the ship than pulling everybody out of flow and things like that. We are accountable to the membership for quarterly reports where we discuss, the overarching strategy, what we set out to do this quarter, how did we actually perform against that? Here's the financial forecast. Here's what we're seeing. And then here are recommendations for either changes or doubling down on, or things in context of goals versus actual performance. And it's a process of getting everybody on board with and communicating really openly to people, and inviting that feedback. But the reality is, and even in an organization where people join on the premise that they want to feel super invested in their workplace and they want that additional layer of ownership and those things, on a long enough time span, people are most interested in that right after they join, and they want to get their fingers in the pie and open all the books and see all the things and kind of get into it. And then eventually they just want to do their job. They don't care. We have the most rotated seat on our board is the director of art, which is sort of the senator of the art team to the board. And that has become almost like a sacrifice, a self-sacrifice that one, that somebody volunteers as tribute every board election cycle to go and sit through the agonizing financial meetings and do those things on behalf of the artists, and they are lauded for it, but it's not. It doesn't really end up being where anybody's heart lies outside of the people who really self-select into it.
And for you personally, right? Like, you sort of set out on this journey, and obviously Mitch brought up the idea of a cooperative very early, and it sounds like it made a ton of sense to you, and you wholeheartedly participated in setting this all up. As you've sort of gone on this 7-year journey of setting it up and figuring it out and making this a stable business, what's been sort of like the hardest part of that journey, the sort of biggest surprise or biggest learning along the way? Sort of like, what are those big things that you reflect on?
Sorry, can you repeat that for me?
Yeah. So as you've been going on the 7-year journey for you personally,
yeah,
setting up this cooperative, getting it all together, what's been the hardest part of that journey for you?
Yeah. Incredible amounts of challenges week to week. Like I said, I walked into this with a very different expectation of what my job was going to be, and I ended up discovering this whole new area of interest, like I said, around team building and around deriving satisfaction from the output of the overall company. But what it means is, even 7 years later, I don't have imposter syndrome per se. Like, I think that my track record proves that I can do it, but it constantly feels like forging further into uncharted territory. So I live about 6 inches outside of my comfort zone at all times in this position. And I can look behind me and see the comfort zone, and then I can look ahead of me and see what actually needs to be done. And I would say that learning to navigate, learning to get comfortable with the cycle of up and down, which is a lot more frequent, a lot shorter wavelength in service industry than it is under a model where you get funding and you say, okay, I have this much runway, right? Like I said, much of what you do is based on conjecture and data backed forecasting. Very little of it is guaranteed past 6 months, 12 months if you're lucky, things like that, because we're not a full codev shop either. We're signing on for campaigns, we're signing on for individual projects, etc. And so the grist coming into the mill is constant, but threatens to dry up at any time. And especially once you scale into a position, like, we're incredibly fortunate to work across like a client list that I'm super proud of and super invested in, but that's a lot of high need relationships that are operating on their own wavelengths constantly together and all need to be overseen. And half of your world can be on fire while the other half is great. And then the polarity can completely invert in the next week. And so living amidst that and trusting that every down has an up, but conversely understanding that every up has a down on the other side of it, has been just maybe the anthemic learning of my time in this seat. Learning to march on that drum beat, as chaotic as it can be, and just trust that the beat's going to continue.
As you have sort of been at this for 7 years, how have you, like, and especially when we think about, you sort of talked about really that struggle of constantly forging further and further into territory that you're not 100% comfortable with. It's kind of outside of your comfort zone. How have you approached dealing with that personally as a founder, like emotionally getting yourself comfortable or dealing with that, the inherent stress that brings, right? Like, how have you dealt with it?
It has been the greatest mechanism for personal growth in my life because I mean, this is not flattering at all, but I have had to learn to tame my inner toddler in such a big way where, you know, still to this day, when something falls through or a stakeholder has a crash out on you or something like that, I still internally have that whole like leap to tantrum, and you cannot let that go external. You have to develop I've had to develop a great suite of tools internally to manage that, because I think it's just a part of my emotional state. Like partially because I feel so invested and so attached to these things. Like the nerve is constantly pretty raw, but the upside of that is that, like I said, it has been this enabling tool for me to get so much practice at it. And I am a much more serene individual 7 years later than I was in 2017, at the end of 2017. And I'm very, very grateful for that. But it does claim a lot of your emotional real estate into the other areas of your life. Like, I'm incredibly fortunate to have a partner who is also super career motivated and whose career takes up a tremendous amount of her time and emotional real estate, and so we're able to understand each other on that axis a lot. But that is a method or a way in which the simple fact of having this job has sculpted my life. And I do think that is part of foundership. Like I said, I don't like mythologizing it, or I don't like trying to attach this like great man of history kind of vibe to that being a founder is like this majestic thing. But it can be totalizing in a way that I don't think other jobs are.
I mean, I think a lot of the reason I do this podcast is to try to demythologize the role and make it really, in many ways, make it really clear, like how hard and to your point, like you will have to fundamentally find ways to change your entire personality to meet this role that you don't have the external support that you would have in a normal role, right?
And I do feel way better for it. Like I am so grateful to have been kicked out of the nest in a way that put me on this path, because I think I became so much more of a professional and so much more of a problem solver than I ever would have become if I hadn't tried this. And I think that that's worth all the Durham and Strong. So
when you think about, and you sort of mentioned this a little bit with people you potentially bring in to be part of the co-op, is like having those support structures and those interest structures that go outside of the job of art and the job of and the role of the company, right? What are your sort of primary support structures for yourself as you have gone on this founding journey?
This is a tough one. You're gonna have to edit out a lot of pause while I think about this.
It's all good.
In some ways, I'm going to break my own rule. Like I said, like you shouldn't necessarily answer these things self-referentially, but I do lean on my colleagues a lot, and it's appropriate to do so because they are properly invested. The relationships that you form with your battle buddies, really, in a cooperative, I think, are the types of relationships that larger companies who tout say like, we're all family here, yada yada, want you to have to your colleagues but through an extractive lens and without properly investing you in like why you should become that close and become that supportive of each other, or put in that extra effort. But like the reality is, in like you said, everybody is effectively my co-founder, and so when one of us needs the extra support, everybody is there to dive in and provide it, and that extends to me as well, in a way that I'm really grateful for. I think part of why I love this podcast after listening to it, and part of why I wish I'd been listening to it longer is because of that work you're saying, like, demythologizing and putting the additional gut check out there for people. In many ways, I think I have been spared the need to cultivate really big support structures outside of work because I have such a comparatively vast range of people within work who, like I said, commensurate with their level of investment, I can lean on for any given problem set in a way that's non-invasive to their life, because you can kind of reach out to people who are not also on fire or things like that, in a way that maybe is harder to do in a duo or trio founder setup.
Do you find, and this is, I'm curious, do you find that, like, I sort of totally understand that, like, part of often the challenge of founders is that you have a very limited set of people who are in that same sort of role, have that same level of investment. And so, like, someone that you hire as an employee won't necessarily have the entire context or the entire understanding to really be leaned on by someone who's a founder, right? But to your point, you have lots of founders. Do you find that that level of support and understanding extends beyond the folks who have really done a term within that board of directors? Because, like, obviously everyone is an owner, but to your point, many people really participate in that ownership in their first few months, and then they're like, you know what, I kind of like art, my guys, like, let me just do art. So do you lean mostly on that sort of board of director crew, or does it truly extend to everyone?
So fantastic insight, especially from somebody who has maybe not experienced it firsthand. It takes years of stewing, or of maturation inside the model to develop that into that co-owner, that fully fledged co-owner, even beyond the point where you really get where you literally get your co-owner stake. That the end of the probationary period is basically like, we believe that you will grow into this, and we can work with you on this level, and we can start breadcrumbing you into the bigger and bigger role like that. Definitely tenure equates to competency in that way. I mean, the first, especially people that we're bringing in from other more traditional models, there's a whole period of just deprogramming, right, where they're not out of the box performing as wholly invested co-founders, because they still have, even if they're intellectually bought in, even if they're ideologically aligned, even if they can write you an essay on why this model makes sense to them and why they care about it, it just takes a lot of time to unwind decades of the sort of subtle flinch to externalize the problem onto a managerial class that does not exist for us, or to feel to assume a level of alienation that does not exist here. Like, people will come to the board and be like, I have this problem and I really want it fixed. I'm like, cool, you actually have all of the tools to do. You actually don't need my permission to fix it, right? I am not your boss. Yeah, doing a tour on the board, I think, is instrumental, or is a way to accelerate that for sure, for people who are artists or individual product managers and producers who don't have pre-existing leadership experience. I definitely think a tour on the board is extremely valuable in that regard, but also it just develops over a long enough period of time, and you do really, like I said, the beauty of this many people who are directly invested is you don't have to go to the same person for every problem that you're having. You can really consider everybody's strengths, personal situation of, a la minute, and where they are in that experience, and either pull people in who will be improved and given opportunity by helping you solve a problem, or people who are currently stronger and more situated than you are to help kind of anchor you and pull you back up. So
what's the biggest gap right now for yourself where you wish you had more support, but you haven't really built it up yet?
Absolutely Even though I just spent some time talking about how much how quickly I feel like I adapted to it, and how tragically I think it's one of my core strengths. I would really love at this point in our development at this scale, et cetera, to have somebody to hand off the sales portion of the event, the business development to. But we're so specialized and we're so relationship driven that I have sought consultation on this point, because it's ultimately the thing that is chewing up the most of my time, and most of my emotional bandwidth. And we just have enough relationships now and enough need for future ones that it cannot all rest on one person. And so I've sought a lot of consultation around this, and basically what staffing agencies, other founders, executive recruiters have all kind of said is like, boy, you need somebody who is fresh out of one of your clients and has like a very up-to-date Rolodex, and like you're hiring somebody's personal relationships and attitude. And those people, even amidst heavy layoff climate and a red ocean of talent, is like one in a million. And so I think that's a huge part. That's been a huge part of my focus this year. It's a huge part of it's like the primary recruiting goal, and the number one thing that I need a backstop for, because everybody else is firing full ahead on their stuff, and the limiting factor is just that extremely personalized piece of the organization that unlocks your ability to scale, your ability to keep everybody focused on what they're doing the best at and what they're most interested in doing.
Totally makes a ton of sense. On the horizon, right? Like as you think about the next 6 months, year, further as it makes sense, what do you really see on that horizon that both for yourself and actually almost primarily for yourself as an individual, but also, that's intrinsically tied to the company as well, that you're thinking a lot about? Like it's sort of the like what's keeping you up at night, but not really in a negative context. Just like,
Yeah.
hey, what are the challenges on the horizon that you're preparing yourself for?
Yeah. So we are extremely fortunate in that, amidst all the downturn, we have sort of flourished amongst adversity. This happened also during the pandemic. I will never use the phrase silver linings in reference to a global mass casualty event or the catastrophic shrinking of our industry, and that has cost so many people their jobs and livelihood and whatnot. However, both of those conditions are uniquely friendly to a streamlined, highly specialized, very durable external service provider that operates fully remotely since our inception, right? A lot of people need the SWAT team while they figure out how to ship the same amount of content with fewer people, or how to overhaul their content in a changing market, etc. And so when I think about the next 6 months to a year, for us, a lot of it has to do with sort of synthesizing a bunch of the points I made earlier. Can we lean into this for growth? Can we rely on the massive uptick and the broadening and deepening of our client base to commit to expanding with more people? Do we need those people to be senior? Can we take the opportunity to invest in some more junior people and begin cultivating them? What is the path through this moment where we are uniquely able to capitalize on the demand in a way that doesn't overcommit us, doesn't set us up, doesn't start a time bomb within the organization for later, but makes the most hay while the sun is shining, because all of that feeds into the durability, the emphasis on durability. And then alongside that, how do we satisfy all this demand without overheating the team, right? Like how do we make all that hay without just burning everybody out? Because the general climate of just existing in the games industry, like it is unavoidable that you will know people who are losing their jobs, people who are undergoing massive life changes, people who are even the ones who keep their jobs are under an incredible amount of stress and things like that. So the general background radiation of stress in the games industry is very high. And then asking people to even your nominal so your pseudo co-founders and your cooperative members who all stand to directly profit share, et cetera, from doing so, how do you say, hey, everybody, you know how we've been running flat out for like 16 months in order to stay at the head of this kind of wave of destruction? Can you run like twice as fast so that we can build a buffer for the next one? So that's what I think about a lot, and how to manage, how to capitalize, how to not overgrow, how to thread the needle such that we come out of this with an intact, sane team. The most amount of benefit that we could extract from it, when, like I said, every up has a down. So when the tide inevitably recedes, how do we make sure that we are not past the waterline? And how do we do that in a way that conforms to our actual values and doesn't make sacrifices on the things that we all agreed to not sacrifice on?
Well, on the burnout front, the nice thing is there's nothing else going on outside of the game industry. There's no background radiation in a geopolitical arena at all. So
it's so telling that I didn't even mention that, because oh God, yeah, of course, because the chaos is total, right? And you can only, I'm so, like I said, the job is so totalizing that I'm so myopic on what field of chaos I am focusing on, because if I really opened up that aperture and allowed myself to consider the global scale, I would just lay down on the floor and not get up, right?
No, 100%. So I always like to close out the main interview portion with an entirely unfair question, which I think is probably a little bit unique in your case. I'm not sure if it's unique in your case, but I'll ask it anyway. Given the experience thus far, right? Like, fast forward some number of years, no judgment on what happens with Wild Blue Studios or not, but you're put in a situation where you could start another company. Would you?
Would and will. It is inevitable that I will start something else in time, because by doing this, I have radically overhauled what my understanding of what a company is. It used to feel like this titanic, unknowable thing, but I like to say it's either the hardest easy thing I've done or the easiest hard thing I've ever done. And I just have such a stronger command over it that I don't fear, or it doesn't feel like so much of a hurdle to clear, because a company is what you make of it, right? As long as you understand what you're on the hook for, it can be very small in accomplishing a very specific task, or you can make a run at something larger, right? But it is almost inevitable that I will identify a market gap or have an idea for a product or something down the line. Like, I'm cooking a software tool on the side with my friend that I will probably make an LLC for before too long here, and things like that. So yeah, I no longer feel like it's something that's just for other people, and I want other people to feel that way too. Whether I would start another cooperative or not is a bigger question. Not, like I said, not every business endeavor is a good fit for it. It really demands a certain set of principles and a certain niche that we were incredibly lucky to fall into on the first try. But another company, absolutely.
I guess you may have already even partially answered this. Also, I'd love to gently call you out.
Yes,
I guess
I insist.
that you're having your outside interest of being another startup feels like maybe not getting you the outside exposure of the extracurriculars. But rather than think about whether you would found another co-op or not, I'm curious what your sort of thoughts are on it being more of a, still sort of a service-based company, or more of a product-focused company, or like a game dev studio. Like, on that horizon, do you feel like, the world's your oyster and you could start any of it? Do you have a particular desire to try something different, or double down on the same?
So maybe one of my most core irrational inadequacies that I carry with me is the feeling that I'm not a real game dev because I haven't actually shipped a title. I've shipped the content for dozens, maybe hundreds of patches of stuff into extant things. I've helped at every stage of game development across a range of products, but never anything end to end. As a personal goal, as a personal satisfaction, I would very much love to eventually, eat the whole elephant and actually start a studio of appropriate size to whatever the concept is, and ship something that I can point at and say, like, okay, I actually did develop a game, right? And I didn't merely develop content for a game or assist in a certain portion of it. So, in a vacuum, I will always look for the opportunity to do that, or angle towards that, or count it among my lifetime goals. But everything else, I think the other thing that I counsel people on when they come to me with ideas is like, when you say what to know before you start, Wild Blue was born partially of the certainty that there was a market for this, right? And I actually have very comparatively low risk tolerance to a lot of other people. Part of why I enjoyed listening to everybody on your podcast is, to me, even just saying what I said about wanting to do it, I think you have to be some amount of crazy to want to develop a game, especially right now, right? It is such a Herculean task. And even if you have something important to say, something novel and fun, something resonant, making a good game is almost 30% of the battle at this point, right? Mm-hmm. In the current pace of production, the amount of offerings, the balkanization of distribution, the just total overwhelm of advertising that that all possible consumers experience every single day. You could make something truly special and it could never find its audience, right? And so that is and beyond my, I would really have to gear up for that. I would really have to feel certain that was something that I actually believed you could go through with. And God knows, when you have a bunch of game artists working in a company together, there's a lot of, hey, we should make something. And then you're like, okay, how do we maintain our position as a world-class vendor while also taking on making a game? And is it that you guys think that you will all get to go make the game, leaving us to recruit an entire new team that can uphold the standard of quality and maintain our relationships on the economic engine of the company while you get to go do the fun thing? Or are we going to hire a bunch of other people who get to do the fun thing while you look in from the outside, funding them with your work? And that generally, that's the axis along which I evaluate. Like I said, I'm very, very materially driven. And so if I were to take on any challenge, has to come from a place where I think that there's an actual success case, where I actually see the path. And I'm very fortunate that I've developed that sense after I took the leap and did the insane thing, because I never would have started this if I had 100% thought that way 7 years ago.
All right. So the last part of the conversation is what I call my introspection lightning round. I'm sure you've heard this when you were listening to the other podcasts, but the idea of this is that these were a series of questions that I would ask potential co-founders very early on, as a basis of just sort of like understanding how we would mesh as co-founders and what kind of organization.
Yeah.
And so I'll just fire through them, whatever you have on the top of your mind for each of them. And we'll go through.
I've tried to resist the urge to pre-plan these responses. As I listened, I was like, all right, don't script your response. Like actually try to treat it like you said, the lightning round.
Yeah, for sure. So we always start with, what is your superpower?
I truly think that the thing I am best at is, you can hot drop me into a room full of people that I do not know on a product that I have not been briefed on, and I can very quickly absorb, categorize, and then iterate on a tremendous amount of information and personality in combination in a very short time. I think that it's one of the places where I'm deployed most with our company is those intakes or those emergency sessions where you're coming in and there's a lot of personality, a lot of personal investment, and just an absolute mammoth amount of context to receive and then organize, and then you have to at the end of an hour walk out with concrete next steps. I feel like both through the practice that I've received at doing that as a service provider, but also just I think that seed was dormant within me all along, but that's definitely where I feel like I excel.
Outside of your superpower, what are your biggest strengths?
I take a tremendous amount of pride in identifying and then enabling and amplifying voices that are getting drowned out in conversations, or identifying people in rooms who are being exiled to the margins but have something important to say, and making space for those people to get in. I think that I am very good at apprehending, enforcing, and articulating and documenting things that protect quality in my specific arena of art. I think that I am pretty good at figuring out I have a pretty developed bullshit meter as well, or bullshit detector as well. So that's where I think the other places that I'm strong.
And on the flip side, what are your big weaknesses?
Like I said, I'm a fairly raw nerve internally. And I'm grateful that I manage that really well externally, but I can definitely be swing from elation to despair pretty quickly. And I think that matches also in a professional sense. Like I said, I have a big emphasis on the articulation and maintenance of quality. And so I can be very all or nothing on product, where it's either the coolest thing ever or worthless garbage in my mind. And you can't say that. If something's not the coolest thing I've ever seen, I have to sort of take it for what it is and engage with it in a productive way, rather than sort of writing it off in my mind. So I would say swings and valleys for me on just kind of the internal and the external wavelengths.
What behaviors are your stress reactions?
Part of managing those things I was talking about is a need to devote private and intentional thought to managing them. So I think under extreme stress, I can operate normally under highly stressful conditions for an extended period of time, but I need a commensurately long period of isolation or privacy afterwards. And that, when I say commensurate, I don't mean 1-to-1. The longer I'm operating under stress, that rate of need for personal recovery scales, geometrically or something after a point. So, my weekends and my nights are very important to me, because otherwise I have no defense against burnout.
And professionally, what are your sort of upkeep needs that, things that need to happen professionally in order to keep you sane and avoid stress reactions?
Things that need to happen professionally. Again, not super flattering, but I need an attaboy every now and again. I try to give those very frequently and very proactively, so that other people who might need them get them, and maybe remember to hand them out to other people. And I think that it's a very vulnerable thing to say, like, I need the back pats, but I do want that. And I also think that stuff that I love to see happen, I may not necessarily need to, but stuff that I really love to see happen is when one of my colleagues or even sometimes clients like really locks in on something and presents a like takes ownership of something that maybe I I'd either resigned myself to or was expecting to or assumed would come onto my plate. I love it when somebody is moved to take ownership of something, and I think that recharges me a lot when it happens.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast with me. I've really, really enjoyed having this conversation. Before we close out, is there any sort of closing thoughts or shout outs that you want to do?
Gosh. Closing thoughts. So I think my closing thoughts after a conversation like this are that amidst the chaos and the background radiation we were talking about, it's important to engage with the idea that you can take control over your destiny. You don't need to wait for people to offer you an out, especially as the entire system turns on its ear and disincentivizes that or restricts the number of lifeboats that are being tossed out. There's still an enormous amount of work to be done, and you are capable, whoever you are, of doing that, of carving out the path to do it. I think it's important to be willing to take a personal step back and make sacrifices with the idea that those investments will come back to you, yes, monetarily, but also just in recovering a sense of stability or building stability for other people, which I think is really the name of the game right now. And I want to say thank you to all the people who equipped me to do that along the way, starting with my childhood and my parents who modeled this stuff and to me, and then the people who gave me an opportunity to have this career, you know who you are, and the people who put up with me when I was a very brash 20-something starting out in this industry. One of your previous guests, I will not say who, but if he listens, he'll know who he is, gave me my first ever piece of corrective feedback. And it's one that I've passed on to a lot of people who come into organizations feeling like they need to prove themselves in a really loud way, and encourage me to listen with maybe pretty actively. And yeah, I think that's it. Is just look out for each other, spread what you know to other people, and plant seeds that you may or may not ever get to sit in the shade of, because every interaction that you have in this crazy environment has the potential to stick with somebody forever and form the basis, or at least be part of the platform upon which they go on to build the rest of their life. So don't ever underestimate your power, for good or for ill, when you take on these types of challenges. So that's it.
And if someone was listening to this podcast and really heard something that they resonate with or want to ask a follow-up question, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah. hello@wildbluestudios.net, or you can use the contact form on wildbluestudios.art, our website. If you want to reach out to me, talk about cooperatives, interrogate any of the opinions I have expressed on this podcast, which are expressly my own and not those of Carl Quo or GMT, you may do so. And hey, if you need really snazzy art for your video game, you can also check those places out and come say hi.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the entire episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends or anyone you think could benefit from it, and leave us a positive rating or subscribe. This episode was edited by Christopher Delano, music by Jake Hull, who's available for composer work in games. And if you're interested in learning more about the Game Founders support community, go to gamefounders.org or email me at carl@gamefounders.org. Thanks so much.